The Eyes of the Killer Robot by John Bellairs, Chapter 5. The next few days were spent in a flurry of activity as the three travelers got ready for their trip. The professor made reservations at the General Stark Inn in Stark Corners, and he got his car oiled and gassed up to go. Fergie got permission from his parents to go on the trip. They were happy that he would get a chance to drive up into the White Mountains and see the lovely fall foliage. Johnny's grandma and grandpa were also glad that he could go away for a while with his two best friends, the professor and Fergie. Both boys packed and phoned up each other to talk and plan, but they did not say a single word to anyone else about the real purpose of this so-called vacation journey. Friday afternoon came, and the boys left with the professor in a cloud of exhaust smoke. The skies were black, and it was pouring rain. Not great weather for traveling, but as the professor said, it would probably let up sometime. The old maroon Pontiac crawled while the windshield wipers slashed away the rain, and the boys sang scouting songs to keep their spirits up. As they drove, the professor tried to point out some scenic spots like Mount Nancy and Mount Bemis, but they were just vague shapes behind gray veils of rain. Finally, around 6 p.m, they pulled into Stark Corners. There wasn't much to the town. A bandstand on a little patch of grass, some restaurants, 2 gas stations, a church, a doctor's office, and a few stores. At the far end of the main street stood a 2-story white inn with a long front porch. The weather signboard outside showed a picture of General John Stark, the cantankerous New Hampshireman who had fought in the Revolutionary War. "Is this where we're staying?" asked Fergie in a disappointed tone. "It looks like a haunted house." "It is not in the least like a haunted house," said the professor primly. "It is a very fine old inn that has been in the same family for generations at least. That is what my guidebook says. Now come on, let's drag our suitcases inside and see where they're going to put us." As the rain pelted down, the professor unlocked the trunk and handed each boy his suitcase. Then he took out his own cracked leather valise and stomped up the creaky steps to the front door. Before he could push the doorbell, the door swung open, and there stood a frowning middle-aged woman with a bun of gray hair. She wore a calico apron over her dress, and the apron had flower stains on it. "Lousy weather, ain't it?" she said, and quite suddenly she smiled. The smile made Johnny feel enormously relieved. He was always frightened by crabby people. "Lousy is the word," said the professor as he stepped inside and shook water off the sleeve of his raincoat. Then he held out his hand. "I'm the Roderick Childermass who called earlier this week. I asked for 2 rooms for the weekend, a double room for the boys and a single one for myself. I do hope you've held them for us." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Childermass," said the woman, shaking his hand. "I'm Anstis Barnstable. I'm the owner, as you may have guessed. Your rooms are upstairs, and we'll be serving dinner in about 20 minutes. Would you folks like to wash up and get yourselves organized?" "We would indeed," said the professor with a satisfied sigh. "Lead on." A short while later, the professor, Johnny, and Fergie were the only guests in the inn, joined by Mrs. Barnstable at a table in a long, narrow dining room. Rain pattered at the windows, but inside everything was warm and cozy. A wood stove at one end of the room took away the evening chill, and on the tablecloth were old-fashioned white china plates, tureens, and platters. The meal was a New England boiled dinner, big chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions swimming in hot broth. The boys dug in greedily, and so did the professor. They hadn't had much to eat for lunch, and they were starved. By the time the dessert was served, the professor was feeling a bit more relaxed and at home, and he decided to shift the conversation to see if he could find out anything about good old Everestus Sloane. "Wasn't there an inventor who used to live in this town?" he asked casually as he lit his after-dinner cigarette. "Some character named Settle or Sumner or something like that?" Immediately, Mrs. Barnstable stiffened. "Where on earth did you hear about that awful man?" she asked. "People hereabouts have been trying hard to forget about him." The professor coughed and glanced away quickly. "Well, I'm certainly not trying to be nosy, but John's grandfather told him a silly story about a robot that this man had made, and—" "I hope that's all he told him," said Mrs. Barnstable severely. "There are stories about Everestus Sloane that are hardly fit for children to hear. He was an evil, twisted person. Do you suppose we can talk about something more pleasant? Boys, would you like another piece of pie? There's plenty in the kitchen." The professor was surprised. He hadn't expected to get such a bad reaction when he mentioned the old inventor's name. However, he knew that it wouldn't do to get pushy. So he shrugged and apologized for bringing up such an unpleasant subject. Then, after Mrs. Barnstable had gone to the kitchen, he leaned over and whispered hoarsely to the boys, "Sounds like old Sloane was a real winner, eh? I knew he was weird, but this lady seems to think he was the devil in human form." "I guess we better not ask her anything more about him, huh, Professor?" said Johnny nervously. "I suppose not," said the professor. "But we'd better not ask where his house was unless we want to get tossed out on our ears. Oh well, we can find out more from somebody else, I suppose." "You hope," grumbled Fergie. He had been pessimistic about this trip before, and he was even more so now. After dinner, the three travelers went to the parlor to relax. The professor read the paper, and Johnny and Fergie played chess. When 10 o'clock came, they were all ready for bed, and they went upstairs and slept soundly. In the morning, when he got up, Johnny saw that the rain had stopped. Sunlight was streaming in through the windows, and little pinkish-gray clouds were drifting over the mountains in the distance. The door to the hall was open, and Johnny could hear the professor singing Latin hymns as he took his morning shower in the bathroom down the hall. Fergie's sheets were rumpled and twisted up at the end of his bed, but he was nowhere to be seen. Probably he was down at breakfast gorging himself, as he had always been an early riser. Johnny felt cheerful and optimistic, though he really didn't know why. He whistled and walked around the room several times, and then he slumped into an armchair by the window and started leafing through a copy of New Hampshire Profiles, a tourist magazine that he had found lying on the windowsill. Suddenly, he stopped turning pages and stared at an article entitled, "The House of Evaristus Sloane. Is it Haunted?" At the top of the page was a pen and ink drawing of a stone house built against a cliffside, halfway up a tree-covered mountain. Johnny swallowed hard. His heart began to beat faster, and the palms of his hands felt sweaty. He tried to read the first sentence of the article, but it was just a blur before his eyes. Then he heard somebody behind him clear his throat. With a nervous little yelp, Johnny dropped the magazine and leaped out of the chair. He turned and stared wildly at the door, and then he heaved a deep sigh of relief. It was the professor. He was in his bathrobe, and a towel was draped around his neck. "Good heavens, John!" exclaimed the old man. "Do you always react that way when someone drops by? Calm down. I just wanted to tell you that the bathroom is free whenever you want to use it, okay?" Johnny was trembling all over. He opened his mouth to speak, but he could hardly get the words out. There's this magazine, and it says that..." "Yes?" snapped the professor irritably. "There's a magazine, and it says what?" Instead of answering, Johnny turned and looked down at the place where he had dropped the magazine, but the magazine was gone. "Oh my gosh!" Johnny stammered. He felt cold all over, and he shuddered. "It was right there. It really was, but now it's gone." The professor folded his arms and cocked his head to one side. He pursed his lips skeptically. "John," he said, "are you sure you didn't just fall asleep in your chair? What's all this nonsense about a magazine that isn't there?" Johnny got more flustered than ever. He stooped and tilted the armchair sideways, but there was nothing under it. With a sad look, the professor walked across the room and put his hand gently on Johnny's arm. "John," he said quietly, "you must have had a little dream when you dozed off in the armchair a few minutes ago. Now scoot on down the hall and brush your teeth while I get into some clothes. This looks like a beautiful day, and we're all going to go exploring." Johnny's mind was in a whirl. Could the professor possibly be right? Were the magazine and the article just a dream? But he had not been wide awake when he found the magazine. But he had been wide awake when he found the magazine. He was sure of that. On the other hand, it would not do to argue with the professor. So Johnny just shrugged his shoulders helplessly and stared on down the hall toward the bathroom. After breakfast, Fergie, Johnny, and the professor left the inn and took a short walk down the main street of the town. They stopped at a variety store and bought a newspaper and some candy bars. While the boys stood around looking at comic books, the professor tried to get some information out of the owner of the store. "Have you ever heard of this Evaristus Sloane character?" he asked as he lit a black and gold cigarette. "You know, the nutty inventor." The owner frowned. "Yes, I have," he said sourly. "What about him?" The professor hemmed and hawed. "Oh, well, you see, the fact is I'm writing a book on old New Hampshire legends, and I want to do a little piece about Sloane. Is it true he used to live in Stark Corners?" The owner grunted. "Not exactly in the town. He lived in a house halfway up Mount Creed, which is the big mountain that kind of hangs over the town. You go out of town about half a mile on Burnt Mill Road, and there's this dirt road that leads up the mountain. If you take my advice, you'll leave your car down at the bottom. Road's not in too great a shape. Anyways, the house is about a half-hour walk up the road. It's all closed up and fallen to pieces. And if you want some more advice, I wouldn't hang around after sunset. The professor stared. Why not? The owner gave the professor a quick, nervous glance. Well, there's a lot of broken boards and nails in the yard, and there's an old cistern with a wooden cover that's all rotted out. You might fall and hurt yourself. You know what I mean? The professor stared harder. There was something about the way the owner was acting that was very creepy and unnerving. Humph! Snorted the professor as he stubbed his cigarette out in an ashtray that stood on the counter. Well, thank you for the advice and the directions. He turned and motioned toward Johnny and Fergie. Come on, boys, we've got a little car ride and a hike ahead of us. The boys grinned and put the comic books back in the rack. Then they followed the professor out the door and down the sidewalk toward the inn. I hate people who won't give you a straight answer, grumbled the professor as they walked along. If the old fool thinks there are ghosts up at Sloane's house, why in blue blazes doesn't he say so? Nails my foot, rotten cistern cover. He just didn't have the decency to say what he meant. Maybe he thought you'd laugh at him, thought Johnny. He was still unhappy about the way the professor had brushed off his story about the disappearing magazine. When they arrived at the inn, Fergie and Johnny waited downstairs while the professor went up to his room and got his camera, pocket compass, and sunglasses. All right, boys, he said as he shoved the camera into Fergie's hands. Are you ready to inspect that nest of spooks and specters? Johnny and Fergie nodded, and they all got into the car. The engine roared, and off they went. When they were about half a mile out of town, the professor slowed down and started looking for the place where they were supposed to turn off. As they rounded a curve, they saw it, a ruddy little dirt road running up into trees that covered the mountain. The professor swerved the car left, and they started bouncing and jolting up the mountain road. Fergie was in the back seat. He leaned forward and started talking into the professor's ear. Hey, Prof, he said. I don't like to crab, but didn't that guy in the store say we shouldn't try and drive up this road? Yeah, said Johnny, who was sitting up in front near the professor. I think he did say that. I know what the man said, the professor muttered testily, but for the time being, the road seems passable, and the professor's little speech was interrupted by a loud musical bong. A rock had hit the underside of the car, but the professor didn't stop. He drove on, and the car jolted and jounced, and the springs squealed and complained. Finally, after a few twists and turns, the road became totally impossible. It turned into a pair of ruts with boulders jutting up here and there, and even the professor could see that driving on was useless. With a muttered curse, he pulled off into a sandy shoulder, and they all got out. It was a good morning for a hike. The sun was shining, and the maple trees were aflame with red and yellow and orange leaves. For half an hour, they slogged up the steep, rocky road. Finally, they came to a little meadow full of tall, bearded grass and purpled pieweed. And there was the house. It was made of yellowish sandstone, and it had a steep pitched roof and narrow pointed gables. The place looked utterly abandoned, and the downstairs windows were boarded up, and the porch sagged. As they trudged along the meadow toward the house, Johnny tripped over a square board that lay hidden in the grass. It was a weathered for sale sign. I'm not surprised they had trouble selling this dump, said the professor as he glanced at the sign. You'd have to be a little dotty to want to live up here the year round. Can you imagine how lonely it would be in the winter? And it's much too grim and gloomy to be a vacation home. He gave the sign a little kick and walked on toward the house. For some reason, nobody wanted to go in right away. The professor snapped pictures and chattered about old houses, and Johnny picked pieweed stalks, and Johnny picked pieweed stalks and then threw them away. Whenever they stopped talking, the oppressive silence of the place began to make them feel nervous, and they would start talking again. As the sun rose higher, the three of them circled around into the yard that lay on the north side of the house. Suddenly, Fergie raised his hand and pointed at something in the middle of the sloping roof. In the middle of the sloping roof was a tiny square window, and there we will pause.